Dear students, welcome back. In the previous session, we have seen the parts of a typical vertebrae. So, normally the typical vertebrae consists of body and then the neural arch. Body and the vertebral arch, we can call it as body and the neural arch, isn't it? So, here now we will see the normal parts of a typical vertebrae. So normally it consists of body and then these are pedicles, and these pedicles run medially and posteriorly. So medially it forms laminae and then it passes backwards to form spinous processes. And on the lateral aspect, so it runs to the lateral side to give transverse processes. Okay, and then at the junction of this pedicle, at the junction of this laminae and the transverse process, and upward projection we can see here, that is the superior articular facet. Okay, and then so if you see on the lateral aspect, we can see the body, isn't it? Body, pedicle and superior articular facet, transverse process and the spinous process. Lamina will not be seen properly here. And then, so if you see the notch, inferior notch is somewhat deeper than the superior notch, because the pedicle is attached only on the upper side of the posterior aspect of the vertebral body. Okay, so on the posterior aspect you can see this is the superior articular facets and this is spine is continued as spinous processes on the posterior aspect. These are the parts of typical vertebrae. So if you take any vertebrae in the vertebral column from cervical region to lumbar region, all these will have same kind of features. Okay, there are some changes which can deviate from these normal structures are called as atypical vertebrae. So each region will have some peculiar features to identify this vertebrae is whether cervical, thoracic, lumbar or sacral. Okay, now we are very much worried about thoracic vertebrae. So there are 12 thoracic vertebrae which lie in the thoracic region of the body. Their size increases gradually from above downwards. And how can you identify the thoracic vertebrae with that of other vertebrae? Means these thoracic vertebrae are identified by the presence of costal facets on the sides of the vertebral body. So normally in a typical vertebrae we can't find these facets on the body, isn't it? So we can see only this superior articular facets at the junction of this transverse processes and the lamina, isn't it? Only here. But in the body there are no articular facets in the remaining vertebrae. So this is the one of the important feature to identify the thoracic vertebrae. On each side, two two facets, these facets are called as costal facets. That means these facets are going to articulate with the ribs, so these are called as costal facets. So normally it may be present as two or it may be present as only one. So in some vertebrae they possess only one facet, and some vertebrae of the thoracic vertebrae shows two facets. These facets are also called as demi-facets. What you call? Demi-facets. Normally, these are located on the sides of the body. You can see on the sides of the body. Normally, this presence of facets at the back side of the body, that means posterolateral side. Posterolateral side of the posterior aspect of the body produces having these costal facets. Okay, that means lateral to the pedicle. So on the posterolateral aspect of the body, the thoracic vertebrae possesses this costal facets. Okay, and also another facet, presence of another facet which are present on the transverse processes, So you can see normally transverse process will not produce any facets in the typical vertebrae, but in the thoracic vertebrae, another extra two facets which are present on the tips of the transverse processes, particularly on the anterior aspect of the transverse processes. So by these features we can identify the side of the the type of the thoracic vertebrae. So here, as we know that there are 12 thoracic vertebrae, out of which from 2nd to 8th, so from 2nd to 8th are typical thoracic vertebrae, and the remaining five, that is 1st, 9th, 10th, 11th and 12th are atypical. So the typical thoracic vertebrae are from 2nd to 8th or typical thoracic vertebrae, and atypical thoracic vertebrae are 1st, 9th, 10th, 11th and 12th thoracic vertebrae. And these atypical thoracic vertebrae present some special features which are not seen in the typical thoracic vertebrae. So they are called as atypical thoracic vertebrae. Okay, now we will see the characteristics of the thoracic vertebrae. As you know that the parts of a normal typical vertebrae consist of body as well as the vertebral arch. So now first we are going to deal with the body. So here the body of the thoracic vertebrae is heart shaped. It is often heart shaped, and also with roughly the AP diameter, that means antero-posterior diameter, and the transverse diameter. So AP diameter and the transverse diameter is almost same. And also on each side, so you can see on the lateral aspect, on each side of this body possesses a pair of facets, superior and inferior facets. These facets are called as demi-facets. These facets are also called as costal facets. So each body possesses on each side two demi-facets are present. One is the superior costal demi-facet and inferior costal demi-facet. Okay, and so with these two costal facets, so on each side, with these two costal facets on each side, so these facets are going to articulate with the ribs, so it is called as costal facet, costal facet. Now, very important thing here, the superior facet, demifacet. So the superior demifacet, still we are in the body itself, still we are in the body, we are dealing with the body. Okay, so the body is heart in shape, and it is having roughly the same measurements in the AP view and the transverse diameter. AP diameter and transverse diameter is almost equal, and also on each side of the body, on the posterolateral aspect, possesses two facets, one at the superior end and another one is the inferior. So the superior one is called as superior costal demifacet and inferior costal demifacet. Both facets are going to articulate with the ribs. When you compare the superior and inferior costal facets, the superior facets are larger than the inferior facets. The superior facets are larger than the inferior costal facets. Okay, and the superior facets lie near the upper border in front of the pedicle. Upper border and in front of the pedicle. Okay, and this superior facet articulates with the corresponding ribs, numerically corresponding ribs. For example, if this is the second thoracic vertebrae, and this superior costal facet is going to articulate with the head of second rib. Okay, when you take this inferior costal facet, so this inferior costal facet is smaller than the superior costal facet. It lie near the lower border in front of the what? Inferior vertebral notch, inferior to vertebral notch, and it articulates with the ribs, heads of the ribs, one number lower than the number of vertebrae. One number lower than the number of vertebrae. So I have told that this one is second thoracic vertebrae, and the superior articular facet is going to articulate with the second rib, head of the second rib, whereas the inferior costal demifacet is going to articulate with the number lower than the number of vertebrae. That means after 2, which number you'll get? Third one. So that means the inferior costal demifacet is going to articulate with the head of the third rib. Okay, this is about the features or characteristics of the body of the typical thoracic vertebrae. Okay, and if you see the attachments to this body, upper and lower borders. So this one is upper and lower borders. So this one is upper border and this one is upper border and this one is lower border. So on the anterior aspect of the body, so and the posterior aspect of the body, some of the attachments are present. These attachments are mainly ligaments. So anterior side, it is attached to anterior longitudinal ligament. Posterior side, it is attached to the posterior side of the body. That means here. So posterior side of the body. So here, this part. So here, it is attached to the posterior longitudinal ligament. Okay, so the body gives attachment anteriorly to the anterior longitudinal ligament, posteriorly posterior longitudinal ligament. The anterior surface of the upper three thoracic vertebrae, lateral to the anterior longitudinal ligament. So actually exactly if you want to say the attachment of anterior longitudinal ligament, though it is attached on the anterior side, it also extends somewhat lateral side. It is also extends somewhat lateral side. Okay, up to here this anterolateral aspect is covered by this anterior longitudinal ligament. By the side lateral to this ligament, it gives origin to the muscle called as longus colli. What you call longus colli muscle. So we have seen this longus colli muscle on the inlet of thorax. What are the muscles present on the posterior aspect of that inlet? So it is related to this longus colli muscle. So it is present on the lateral aspect of the. So for example, so if this is the what you can call as anterior longitudinal ligament, lateral to this, that means lateral to this, here and here, it is having longus colli muscle. So it gives attachment to the longus colli muscle. Okay, and margins of costal facets, that means here you can see this is the margins of the costal facets gives attachment to the capsular ligament as well as radiate ligaments of costovertebral joints. So capsular ligament and also radiate ligaments of costovertebral joints. So these are the attachments present on the body. So these are the attachments present on the body, upper and lower borders, and also anterior surface and also margins of the costal facets. Again we will see what are the attachments. So from upper and lower borders, it is attached to anterior longitudinal ligament. So here you can see anterior longitudinal ligament, anterior somewhat lateral part, anterolateral longitudinal ligament, and then posteriorly posterior longitudinal ligament. Lateral to anterior longitudinal ligament of upper three thoracic vertebrae. Only upper three thoracic vertebrae lateral to anterior longitudinal ligament gives origin to longus colli cervicis muscle. Cervicis means at the cervical region. Longus colli cervicis muscle on each side. And the margins of this costal facets gives attachment to the capsular ligament and radiate ligaments of. So what is the joint formed here? Means so here the rib is getting attached here. So rib is called as costo and vertebrae. So a joint between the costa and vertebrae. So it is called as costovertebral joints. So capsular and radiate ligaments of costovertebral joint. Okay, this is about the attachments to the body of typical thoracic vertebrae. Now we have seen the characteristics of the body as well as the attachments of the body of the typical thoracic vertebrae. Now coming to the vertebral foramen. Okay, so normally, for example, if you can show this upper superior costal superior vertebral notch is somewhat shallow and inferior one is deep, isn't it? So then what happens? For example, another vertebrae which is present below this one. So isn't it? Already this one is deep. Okay, so So here the pedicle is present here, and in between we'll have the intervertebral disc. Here we are having intervertebral disc, and this is the pedicle, so which forms the superior facet here, and it is going to attach. So if you can see, this vertebral foramen is almost, the size is very small in the thoracic region, and nearly it is circular in shape, because the pedicles do not show lateral deviation. The pedicles do not show any lateral deviation as they pass backwards. అంటే స్ట్రైట్గా వస్తుందమ్మా చూడండి, ఇక్కడ పెడికల్స్ స్ట్రైట్గా వస్తుంది, టిపికల్ థొరాసిక్ వర్టిబ్రల్. సో మామూలుగా వాళ్ళు చెప్పడం ఏమంటే, సో if they didn't make any angulation, so like this pedicle is going somewhat laterally like this, so that is not present in thoracic vertebrae. So it is nearly circular because pedicles do not show any lateral deviation as they pass backwards from the body. Okay, this is about the vertebral foramen. The vertebral foramen size is smaller, nearly circular in shape, because pedicles do not show lateral deviation as they pass backwards from the body. And coming to the pedicles, next one is the pedicles. So these pedicles project directly backwards. You can say directly backwards, or attached close to the upper borders, so that so you can see here, so the pedicle is attached to the upper borders, not at the lower borders, so that the inferior vertebral notches are deeper than the superior vertebral notches. So the superior vertebral notch is shallow, and inferior vertebral notch is in depth. Okay, so this is about the pedicles simply. And coming to the laminae, here the laminae are short, broad and thick. So the laminae are short, broad and thick. Okay, and overlie each other from above. That means, so this is the superior vertebrae, so total another vertebrae is present here. So what happens here means, the laminae of the next vertebrae, which will overlie overlie each other from above. That means the laminae is touching with that of the laminae of the superior vertebrae, thoracic vertebrae. Okay, so in the laminae, so this part is called laminae, isn't it? This part is laminae. For this laminae, this becomes the anterior aspect. So that means the vertebral foramen posterior border is formed by the anterior border of the laminae, isn't it? Yes. So the upper border and the lower border. So upper border and the lower border, upper border and the lower part of the anterior surface. So upper border and the lower part of the anterior surface gives attachment to another ligament called ligamentum flavum. What you call ligamentum flavum. Now how many ligaments we have seen? Anterior longitudinal ligament, posterior longitudinal ligament. Now another ligament now we are going to see is the ligamentum flavum. So this ligamentum flavum will be present here, okay, in front of the laminae. Okay, so this is the attachment seen on the laminae. Now coming to the superior articular facets. Here you can see the superior articular facets on the posterior view of the typical thoracic vertebrae. So this one is the superior view, and this one is the lateral view, and this one is the posterior view. Now see how these facets are present. These project upwards. These are projecting upwards at the junction of laminae and pedicles. At the junction of laminae and the pedicles. So the superior articular facets are projecting upwards. Okay, these articular facets face backwards. So if you can see, so how it is facing, so it is facing backwards because it is posterior aspect. That means the facet is facing backwards, and also somewhat here you can see, so backwards and laterally, backwards and laterally, and upwards. Here we can see the upward position of this vertebrae, superior articular facets of this vertebrae. So how, where the superior articular processes are present? These project upwards at the junction of laminae and pedicles, and articular facets. So this facets, this blue color facets face backwards, laterally, and upwards. So this is about the superior articular facet. Coming to the inferior articular facets, here the inferior articular facets we can't see, so it is present in front of this laminae. So here you can see the inferior articular facet. So this project downwards from the lateral ends of the laminae. So this is the lateral ends. So downward. So these project downwards. So it is projecting downwards at the junction. Downwards from the lateral ends of the laminae. From the lateral ends of the laminae. And this articular facets face forward. So it is present in front, isn't it? So it is facing forward. It is facing forward, and also medially and downwards. Medially and downwards. So exactly opposite to the superior articular process, isn't it? Why? Because this inferior articular facets are going to articulate with the superior articular facets of the below vertebrae, isn't it? So normally superior articular facets and inferior articular facets are oppositely faced. So this is about the superior articular processes and inferior articular processes. Now coming to the spine here. Now coming to the spine, you can see the spine here. So the spine passes. So after forming the laminae, after uniting this thing, it moves or it passes backwards. It passes backwards and downwards. It passes backwards and downwards, and ends in a tubercle. So here this one is the tubercle actually. So this is the tubercle, ends in a tubercle. This is the tubercle here. Okay, so this is about the spine. The spine passes backwards and downwards, ends in a tubercle. Okay, and this spine will give attachments to number of muscles. So normal number of muscles as well as some of the ligaments. So this one is spine, isn't it? So the spine is giving attachment to the supraspinous ligament. The ligament is present on the spine, so it is called as supraspinous ligament. That means all spines, all vertebral spines are getting attached with that of supraspinous ligament. And also interspinous ligament. That means, so if you have another body here and it is having pedicle and then spine, that means each spine to spine, In between these two spines, one ligament is present. That ligament is called as interspinous ligament. Supraspinous means this ligament will join with all the spinous processes of all the vertebrae. So they are called as supraspinous. Interspinous means in between the two spinous processes, this ligament having an attachment. And also this spinous processes also giving attachment to the rhomboids major and minor. We know that. So the medial side on the posterior aspect of the scapula muscles are going to attach with the vertebral column, isn't it? So this vertebral column includes this vertebrae, isn't it? So rhomboids major and minor, serratus posterior, superior and inferior. You people know serratus anterior. And serratus posterior muscle is also present, and that serratus posterior muscle will have superior and inferior type of serratus muscles are present. We are going to see those muscles when we are going to deal with the back muscles. We are going to deal with back muscles. So just now remember that one. Okay. And also it gives attachment to the latissimus dorsi, trapezius, multifidus, sacrospinalis, and semispinalis capitis. So latissimus dorsi, trapezius, multifidus, sacrospinalis, semispinalis capitis, serratus posterior superior, and serratus posterior inferior. All these muscles are back muscles. Back muscles which give support to the entire vertebral column. Okay, entire trunk, we can call it as entire trunk. So these muscles are going to support on the posterior aspect of the entire trunk. Okay, now the last part, which is remaining in the typical thoracic vertebrae, is the transverse processes. What we call transverse processes. These transverse processes are in big size. Transverse processes are in big size and also club shaped. Okay, and also club shaped and are directed laterally and backwards. So they are directed laterally as well as backwards. Laterally and backwards. Not like this. This is horizontal laterally. So laterally and backwards. Okay, laterally and backwards. So the transverse processes are large and are directed laterally and backwards from the junction of the pedicles and laminae. From the junction of pedicles and the laminae. So not this superior artery. So the junction. Okay, of the laminae and the pedicles. So the anterior surface of each processes bears a facet near at its tip for the articulation with the tubercle of the rib. Tubercle of the corresponding rib. So we know that the superior one articulates. If it is second head of the rib is going to articulate, and that rib will have tubercle on the medial aspect. So that tubercle is going to articulate with this one. So like this. So here this is the head of the rib, and it is having one tubercle. That tubercle is going to articulate here, and then the rib will move anteriorly like this. So when we deal with the rib, then you can understand the parts of that rib where it is going to articulate. Okay, the posterior end of the rib will have head, and it is having neck and a body. That body will have a tubercle. So that one, so head articulates here, and then the tubercle. So here, and then the rib will come on the anterior aspect. Okay, so this transverse processes is having a facet for the tubercle of rib on the anterior aspect at its tip. So in the upper six vertebrae, the costal facets which are present on the transverse processes are concave in nature. From where to where? Upper six vertebrae. Upper six vertebrae, the articular facets are concave in shape. So which will articulate with the tubercle of the rib. Tubercle of the rib. Only upper six thoracic vertebrae possess such kind of facets. Okay, and then in others, that means after six, in others the facets are flat. The facets are flat. Up to six it is concave, and then the facet become flat. So somewhat flat, and face upwards laterally, and slightly forward. Okay, so the facets are flat and face upwards and slightly forward. Okay, and the spine is long and is directed downwards and backwards. The fifth to ninth spines are longest. Fifth to ninth spines are longest, and also more vertical. And also more vertical means so sloping. So more vertical and overlapping with the below spinous processes. Okay, and the upper and lower spines, so that means the atypical ones, the upper and the lower spines are less oblique in direction. They are not this much having slope. They are not having such kind of sloping is seen in upper and lower spines. Okay, this is about the typical thoracic vertebrae. And the attachments to the thoracic vertebrae are lateral costo-transverse ligament. So this ligament is present. So we know that the tubercle of the rib is articulating with the uh, transverse process, isn't it? So the joint formed here is the costo-transverse joint. So the ligaments which are supporting this joint is called as costo-transverse ligaments. So these costo-transverse ligaments are of various types. One is the lateral costo-transverse, superior costo-transverse, and the posterior costo-transverse ligament. So that means to the tip, lateral costo-transverse ligament is getting attached, and superior costo-transverse ligament to the lower borders, to the lower borders, and posterior costo-transverse ligament is present at the base. So that means below the base. Okay, so you have to understand the superior and posterior costo-transverse ligament. To the lower border of the transverse process, superior costo-transverse ligament is present, and below the lower borders, it is having a base. So that base is getting attached with the posterior costo-transverse ligament. Okay, and it is also gives attachment to the intertransverse muscle to the upper borders. Intertransverse muscles to the upper border. That means another transverse process here like this. If you can see on the posterior aspect. So in between the transverse processes. A muscle is getting attached to the upper borders. So that muscle is called as intertransverse muscles. And also it gives attachment to the deep muscles of the back. Deep muscles of the back on the posterior aspect. So the transverse process gives attachment to the deep muscles of the back. So this is about the typical thoracic vertebrae. So in this I have explained both the osteology for practicals as well as theoretical. So if they can ask for your practicals also, you have to explain from the identification. How can you identify this bone? What are the features present in this vertebrae which differs from the other regions of vertebral column, and also if they place typical and atypical thoracic vertebrae also, you have to differentiate the typical thoracic vertebra from the atypical thoracic vertebrae by considering above all these points. Okay, thank you.